The Orphans of Simitra. Chapter 7. In each bed lay an orphan. It was a big dormitory, as long as a street, feebly lit the night lights on the ceiling, with dozens and dozens of beds ranged in 3 rows. And in each of these beds was an orphan. More than 300 of them were living in the old barracks that had been transformed into a home, the girls in one wing, the boys in the other. They had been moved there, to Lysira in Thessaly, until something better turned up. In that dormitory, Porphyro's bed was the 5th on the right as you came in. His bed was like all the rest, except for the view of Simitra, cut from a newspaper, that he had fastened to its head. The boy on his left was from Tima. Porphyros had met him first in the tent, and then had come upon him by accident a few days later. His name was Zymes, and he was 13, a few months older than Porphyros. He had been dragged from the ruins of his home with a slight leg wound, which had already healed. Like Porphyros, he would never see his mother or father again. His grief was pitiful to see, for nothing would console him. He was not alone in the world, however. The disaster had spared him a sister and a grandfather. Both were at the moment in a hospital, but he would rejoin them later. It was nearly always at night that his loss became unendurable. After lights out, he would burrow beneath his bedclothes, and Porphyros could hear him sobbing. Porphyros would stretch out to take the boy's hand in his own. "Don't cry, Zymes. Don't cry. I'm here. I've just been looking at the sky. It's all filled with stars. It'll be fine tomorrow, so they're sure to take us for a walk." Every night Porphyros found something pleasant that Zymes could look forward to on the following day, and every night he succeeded in calming his grief, until in the end Zymes fell asleep, still holding his friend's hand. In the morning, when he woke up, very much ashamed of his weakness of the night before, he would turn to Porphyros and smile his thanks. One day he said to him, "It's queer, Porphyros. You seem to be happy, in spite of everything, while I shall always be miserable." "I'm not happy, Zymes." "Well, you enjoy the games they organize to cheer us up. I often hear you laughing. And whenever a truck comes down the street and stops in front of the garage, you always climb up to the window to look at it, and I can see then that you're happy." Porphyros was astounded, and just a little hurt. It was quite possible to be deeply unhappy and yet still feel like laughing sometimes. The two things were quite different. Every time he thought of his home, his heart bled, and he knew why his face had grown thinner. But his home was not only Mama, Papa Christopher, Constantine, it was also the fields that smelled so good, that would always be scented with thyme and savory and lavender. It was Mina, who was all he had and whom he must keep safe from all harm. And now there was Zymes too, whom he would never have known except for the catastrophes. Certain people, certain things, were dead. Other people, were alive, and he was one of them. But how could he explain these complicated matters to Zymes, when he felt instinctively that he was right, without being able to express his thoughts? He knew that he must not give way to grief. Mina and Zymes as well needed him. There was no harm in keeping possessed for life. One morning Zymes said, "I wish we could be together always." But he pointed to the empty bed nearest Porphyros on the left, then to another a little farther away, then a third. "Perhaps I'll never get away," sighed Porphyros. Then, looking at his friend, he added, "I'd rather stay here." For some time now gaps had been appearing in the dormitories. The extent of the damage had brought about, in Greece and in many other countries, a tremendous feeling of brotherhood. Hundreds of letters poured into Athens. Offers of hospitality, particularly for orphans, came from all quarters of the globe. The ship had already set out for Turkey. There was talk as well of the northern countries. "Since you and your sister have no folk anymore, you're bound to go," sighed Zymes. "Would you like to go to a foreign land?" "I don't know. I'd like to travel, but only if I could be sure of coming back. Some foreigners stopped at our garage once, in Simitra. They'd come from a long way away, from Norway, I think. They could speak a little Greek. While Papa Christopher was doing the repairs, they looked at the scenery around at Perus. They kept looking up at the sky and saying they'd never seen so clear a sky anywhere. I could see they weren't saying it just to please us. They were much too delighted." "Well, I feel like that about our sky, Zymes. I wouldn't want to lose it. I'm glad I'm Greek." "So am I, Porphyros. They talked together every morning and every evening, when they got up and when they went to bed. But for Porphyros the best hours of the day were those spent with Mina. He had always been extremely attached to his sister. Now she was all the family he had, and he felt that he had a special duty toward her. It was his job now to look after her, and the responsibility was at once heavy and welcome. Mina returned his affection with all her heart. It was her love for her brother that had saved her life. Just before the terrible earthquake that razed Epirus to the ground, she was having a meal. Anxious about her brother's long absence, she had risen from the table and rushed out to see if he was coming. The cataclysm came upon her as she stood by the garage, and a tile had cut into her face. Porphyros was able to see his sister every day in a courtyard that formed part of the barracks. There they told each other all the little bits of news going around the home, talked about Simitra, or else fell silent, quietly enjoying the pleasure of being together. On this particular afternoon, Porphyros hardly knew his sister. He had grown used to seeing her in the big white bandage that went around her head and beneath her chin, and now it was all off, and there was only a small crisscross dressing near her temple. "Look," she said. "Does the scar show much? Do you think it will always be there?" "I can't hardly see it, Mina. Do I look just as I did before?" He hesitated, then said yes, exactly. It was not quite true, it would probably never be true. The scar made a long wheel that would never completely disappear. But Porphyros knew that girls thought a lot about their looks, and he did not want to upset her. "I'm sure it will soon disappear." The little girl smiled, reassured. Then she said, "Good, then I won't be so ugly for the journey." Porphyros frowned. "What journey?" "Oh, haven't they told you?" "We're leaving, Porphyros. I don't know where we're going, except that it's very far away. We were called into the office. They said we'd be very much happier than we are here. Everyone would spoil us, but why aren't you pleased, Porphyros? Don't you want to go?" He nodded. "Are you sure we're both going?" "No one said anything to me." "When did they tell you?" "This morning, after breakfast." Porphyros questioned his sister further, then, seeing the matron, he went straight up to her. "Is it true that we're leaving?" he said breathlessly. The matron's smile faded. Porphyros' heart sank as she put her arm around his shoulders and drew him to her. "I am going with Mina, aren't I?" "I'm afraid not, dear. Very few families, you see, are willing to take two children. And then, you are big and strong, you'll soon be ready to earn your living. You can stay in Greece. Mina wouldn't want to go without me. I know she'll be unhappy at first, but she'll soon settle down all right. She needs a lot of building up, your little sister. Haven't you noticed her pale cheeks and the dark shadows under her eyes? And of course you'll be able to write to each other as much as you like." Mina came to join them. The matron turned to the little girl. "You want to go, don't you?" Mina understood. Her head bowed. She stood there crying silently. "Have you really changed your mind?" The little girl's sole reply was to cling desperately to her brother's arm and hide her face against him. The matron went on, "Look, Porphyros, you're a big boy now, and you must try to understand. It won't be a long separation. It's only for a few months, and it's for your sister's good, for the sake of her health. Marina will come back to you with rosy cheeks and a good appetite. It will be easier for her to forget what has happened when she is away from here." Shaken, Porphyros looked from the matron to his sister. He did not speak. Obviously the matron insisted, making her point. "We can always do as we like. In any case, Marina won't be leaving for a few days. You'll have time to get used to the idea. From now on, you'll have permission to be with each other for longer time each day." She went off smiling. Porphyros and Mina stood there side by side, hand in hand. Without speaking, they walked to the big yew tree at the far end of the yard, so that they could be alone. In spite of the cold, they sank down on a stone bench. Mina put her head on her brother's knees, and suddenly burst out crying. "I don't want to, Porphyros, I don't want to." The poor boy had no idea what to do or what to say to comfort her. "Don't think about it anymore, Mina. We've several days ahead of us, and we shall be seeing more of each other." When the bell rang, they found it the dormitory was the center of a great sorrow. For a long time Porphyros wept beneath the bedclothes. Then Zymes stretched out a hand to comfort his friend. "Don't cry. Porphyros Mina hasn't gone yet. Who knows what may happen in the next few days." The following day, Porphyros found his sister very pale, and the day after that, paler still. She would die of grief if she went. Taking his courage in both hands, he approached the matron again, and this time she was not so gentle with him. She accused him of working on his sister's feelings. The decision had been made, nothing could be done about it. He went away, with his head bowed, and that night bed number 5 was again shaken by his weeping. Porphyros always reacted quickly. If nothing could be done, the best thing was to forget it at once. But when something could be done, and it could— "Oh," said Zymes, when Porphyros told him his plan. "You can't do that. I will not allow my sister to be taken away from me." Grown UPS seem to think they can arrange everything to suit themselves. "Anyway, Zymes, don't be surprised if tomorrow night my bed stays empty." "You mean to go off with Mina?" "Where? I don't want her to leave me." "It's bad to go off like that, to run away." "I'm not really running away. I only want Mina to stay with me. We'll go and hide somewhere, and when the train's gone, we'll come back." Every afternoon, weather permitting, the young refugees of Epirus were taken for a walk, the boys going one way, the girls another. Once in the country, they were allowed to run where they liked. It would not be difficult to escape. That was what Porphyros had decided to do. Mina as well. For their meeting place he fixed upon the ruins of an old temple on the hillside looking over Lysira. Porphyros watched the sky the whole of that morning. The evening before, the sky had clouded over, and a few raindrops had fallen in the yard. But in Greece the sky is never overcast for very long. From the heights of Olympus the benevolent god Zeus sends squadrons to sweep it clear of the great clouds. It would be fine today. After their meal, the children assembled in the yard and set off at once. The boys, in a long line, went through the village streets. Porphyros never even thought of staring at the service stations and the gasoline pumps, as he normally did. He thought only of his sister. He was walking in the rear with Zymes, and they were holding hands. "So that's understood, Zymes. You won't say a word, since we'll be coming back." "I won't say a word, but I'll be thinking of you all the time." It so happened that they were taken to the ilex woods south of the village, near the quarries. "You see, Zymes, you must admit I'm always lucky." When they came to the thickets, the children disbanded. The quarries were riddled with hiding places. Porphyros shook hands warmly with his friend, hugged him unobtrusively, and disappeared. As soon as he thought he was out of sight, he began to run as fast as he could through the undergrowth, avoiding the paths and goat tracks. Half an hour later he arrived, out of breath, within sight of the crumbling columns of the temple of Helios, standing like ancient torches among the rocks. Mina had not yet come. There was nothing surprising in that, for the girls had set out after the boys. They always forgot something or other at the last moment. And then, Mina couldn't run as fast as he could. He sat down on one of the marble slabs roughened by the depredations of centuries. He was free and happy. And since he was free and happy, he began to think of the barracks in which he had been living for the last 3 weeks. Porphyros was like that. He only realized that he had been unhappy when it was all over and, by comparison, found himself contented with his lot. How wonderful it was to discover another horizon, so wide, so blue, the beautiful Grecian countryside hardly touched by winter's icy fingers. For a long time he stared at the misty blue horizon, until it seemed to him that behind the distant hills there was yet another that for a long time had been hidden by shadows, his own special horizon, where he would be able to sell gasoline. He had come back to his gasoline pumps. They were, for Porphyros, the boys that always remain afloat in spite of shipwreck. Hands are stretched out to them. Not everyone reaches them, but right to the very end they offer hope. Sitting on the marble slabs gilded by the winter sun, he began to dream again of his red overalls. He did not regret the uniform that lay among the ruins of his home. He found it pleasant now to dwell upon the more holes, the tarnished buttons, and the missing trousers. The overalls he intended top-tab later would be very much better. Time goes quickly spent in thought, quicker still in dreaming. Porphyros was startled to see the shadows of the great yews climbing across the marble flagstones, to feel the cold air creeping down his neck. He got to his feet and scanned the deserted hillside. No reason for worry yet. The girls must have gone to the other side of the village, and that would mean the wide detour for Mina. Unless he knew Mina. She wanted to be with him so much that she would be careful to choose the right moment for her escape. He tried to lose himself again in his vision of service stations and gasoline pumps, but he found it very difficult. He was seized by a nagging fear. It is true that in Greece the winter sun keeps nearly all its summer's heat, but the nights make up for it. He shivered under the malicious touch of a breeze sharp as a green lemon. Still Mina did not come. With all his strength he rejected the through the village with the others, on her way back to the home. "I'll count up to 1,000, he told himself. And he began to count, tapping with the toe of his shoe. The sun threw out a great sheaf of rays like an armful of branches seized on a dying fire, and was extinguished behind the mountains. As he had done in the past, Porphyros lifted his eyes to look for the first stars. Those he saw were diamond bright. It would freeze tonight. Anxiety took firmer hold. He saw Mina lost, wandering through the fields, crying out with terror. Yet he still wanted to believe she would come. He risked showing himself on the hillside, shouting, "Mina! Mina!" The silence of approaching night was absolute. His own voice frightened him. He came back to the marble steps and sat down, shivering with cold. The town, deep in shadow, was a shapeless mass. But soon it shone forth dazzling white. The moon had risen above the mountains of Pindus. A sudden hope shot through him. If it was just that Mina was lost, she would be able to see her way now. He waited. An hour passed. The hard stone drew all the cold of the night. He dared not sit down. Leaning against a column, he stared desperately over the valley. Midnight bells sounded in the distance. She would not come now. Perhaps, at the end of her endurance, she had collapsed somewhere in the brushwood. Why had he waited so long before running to help her? He stumbled down the hill, to the right, to the left, tripping over the sharp-pointed stones. And suddenly he found himself among houses, on the outskirts of the town. What could he do? The town meant the barracks. He could not go there. Retracing his steps, he looked everywhere for her. But the town, milky white under the moon, drew him back in spite of himself. He ventured into the streets. Every time a shadow fell along the pavement, he flattened himself against the doorway. When the shadow passed, he ran on again, his heart thudding, believing he saw Mina in the distance. He walked about for a long time, exhaustion dragging at his heels, the cold going right through his clothes. Hunching his shoulders, he wandered on without knowing where he was going, with his elbows pressed close to the sides. Where was he making for? He went on like a sleepwalker, and maybe he was indeed asleep. Suddenly he shivered. There rose before him a long wall pierced with windows all exactly alike. His feet had brought him back, unconsciously, to the barracks. His anxiety, numbed by exhaustion, flared up again. Was Mina there, behind that great wall? No, he could no longer wait. He had to know. The heavy iron gate was securely bolted, and over all hung the dignified silence. He pushed with all his strength, but he no longer had any strength. He had spent it all night long, looking for his sister. Tears, until then resolutely held back, forced their way through his eyelids. Porphyros realized that the little courage he had left was fast ebbing away. He crumpled up against the foot of that high wall, abandoned and overcome with cold. The porter found him there the following morning when he came out to sweep the pavement. The boy's first words were not for himself, but for his sister Mina. "Where is Mina?" He was carried into the white-painted sanatorium, where a cup of coffee revived him, and there he learned why Mina had not come to meet him on the hillside. Worn out with grief, the little girl had collapsed just as she came out of the refectory. In spite of all her protestations she had been put to bed, and later, when her brother's absence was discovered, she confessed everything. So Porphyros returned to the home. He was scolded, but all the same he was forgiven, and as it turned out, he got what he wanted. Brother and sister were not to be separated. They would either stay in the home or leave together.